All right, AP Human Geography. We are right back to it in Unit 4 here. Again, this one that it wants to try to take control of us, but we will not be controlled, will we? I am going to run you through, kind of getting my notes here in front of me, being it's going to like pop stuff up on the screen. It's like, oh, surprise, what is it here? We're going to, actually, it's going to be like a little history lesson coming at you, okay? Is what we have coming here today. And we're going to look at some topics. Maybe some of you had some exposure to some of this before, depending on what kind of social studies you had when you were in middle school. I'm going to approach it from kind of assuming nothing, and so kind of run you through this. But this kind of gets into, again, we're in our section on political processes, and this is getting into, I guess, really when you get right down to it, the history of political processes. So let me first of all get down here to all this stuff that we've already been able to go through together, and this is where we left things off in class last time. And so I'm going to jump here with number 2 and introduce you to concepts of imperialism and colonialism. Okay, and we're going to get a little bit into what they are, what's the difference between them, and some examples of the development of imperialism and colonialism through the 4 centuries we've got listed there. Okay, and so I'll start you off. If we got to connect in, again, you've got maybe a little bit more slightly detailed version of this on your vocab sheet, but this is kind of giving you the idea of what imperialism is. Okay, and so typically it's going to be one state, a lot of times one state that is large and powerful and probably has a lot of military power and that kind of thing, large army, large navy, who oftentimes will find a smaller, weaker country that they will conquer. Pretty much send their military in and acquire them. This is kind of like the beginnings of like building an empire, in effect, by taking them over. And then usually the goal for taking them, or the reason behind it, the motive, okay, get the right word there, Floyd, is to make money. Okay, with imperialism, a lot of times it is about making money. It isn't just to say, oh, look at all the land I own, lucky me, I can pat myself on the back. No, it's about profit. It's about making money. And so when we talk about that economic control, that's a big one with imperialism, and we see back in history, and we see even now, really today, when we see examples of imperialism or potential imperialism happening in front of us, a lot of times it is driven by, ultimately, by someone's need for more economic profit and gain. Okay, and then we'll also find out sometimes that imperialism, as a secondary reason, is what we call cultural dominance. All right, and this kind of gets into some of what we learned about back in Unit 3 with assimilation and some of those concepts. Okay, that is what imperialism is all about. And so, just like you see the guys here who represent some European countries back in older times, who are kind of trying to figure out, they got the map there, they got the globe in front of them. What am I going to take? What do you get? What do you have? Kind of like, we're just going to split things up here, kind of an idea. All right. Now, colonialism is, like it says there, it's a form of imperialism. That's the IMP. All right. And so it is a type of imperialism or form of imperialism. And there's more of an emphasis on this one, that once that larger country or empire has conquered the smaller one that they want, that more of their people will move into the conquered land. Okay, they're going to move over as settlers and establish themselves. Pure imperialism doesn't always include that. There can be the idea that sometimes you just, you conquer simply to make profits, but you're not necessarily going to encourage the people of your country or empire to move to that place. You may just say, no, we're just going to keep some soldiers over there, and then what people we need over there to help make some money for us. Okay, the reason we conquered in the first place. Okay, sometimes there's going to be the creation of some of these territories under imperialism, where there's a really strong push to have your people go in there and settle it. One of the reasons a lot of times countries will do that is because it gives you a stronger claim over the land. if you just newly conquered this territory and you're worried about maybe one of your other empires trying to steal it from you, one of the ways you can try to counter that is to get a bunch of people, your people, to move in there. And it's kind of like, well, look, it's ours. We're using it. We got a bunch of our people there. What are you going to do? It's ours. It kind of gives a little bit more of the argument as to why, hey, everyone else, hands off, right? The example I've got over there on the left side, when Britain created their 13 colonies, over here in America, they had competition. The Spanish wanted that land, the French wanted that land, and one of the ways that the British made sure that they kind of held their grip on it, until the American Revolution, was to encourage British people to come over here. All right. Some of them didn't need a lot of encouragement because, they were trying to get out of Britain anyway. They were being persecuted because of their religious beliefs and things like that. But a lot of others, they're pretty much the government saying, hey, there's money to be made over there. You might find gold, you might find silver, who knows? But, you could go over there and get rich. And so you got this really strong push to get those people over there to help settle the land and to strengthen the claim that you have over that land. Okay, so that is the difference between imperialism and colonialism. Know the difference, all right? Okay, historically, hey, if you take some AP World with me next year, man, you get if this kind of stuff interests you, you'll get enough of this to keep you happy for the rest of your life, because we spend a lot of time on these topics in AP World. Earliest imperialism, and this is going back to everything from the Portuguese, who start doing some exploring of Africa and into the Indian Ocean region in the 1400s. And then you've got 1492 when Christopher Columbus, sailing for the Spanish, makes his kind of quote unquote, kind of accidental discovery of the New World over here. And then Spain, Portugal, joined by France and Britain, even the Dutch get involved with establishing colonies over here in the New World, okay, in the Americas. And we kind of, what motivates them to do this, we usually kind of condense it down to those 3 G's. They're coming over with the hopes of making money, making profit. It might be finding gold. For many of them, it's going to be planting crops that are, that can be sold and is very profitable. Some of them will find gold. They will find silver. The draw of the potential of making money, right? Some will come over because they want to spread the word of the Lord. We'll have Jesuits, missionaries who will come over to the New World and will try to convert indigenous people to various forms of Christianity, whether it's Catholicism or some forms of Protestantism. But you have these missionaries that you get the God, and then there's just the good old idea of people going into a land that was unknown to Europeans. It's an adventure. And it's a chance to, potentially, depending on what you do when you get over there, put yourself in the history books. That's kind of where we get a little bit of that glory in there. All right. So that's your early phase of imperialism. That's kind of what kind of takes us from, like I said, 1400s, kind of out into right into the early 1800s. I guess we could kind of put that. All right. And then when we start getting smack dab into the 1800s, we will see imperialism and then colonialism as, again, a subset of that really begin to explode as we start to see the growth of these really big European empires. And it does. It first starts with the Spanish, but pretty soon the British are right in there with what will eventually be the biggest empire in all of world history. Okay, the French have their involvement, and then eventually, as new countries are formed in Europe, Germany, Italy, they'll want their land too. And so when we talk about that colonialism, oh no, do I have this on? I want to make sure I'm getting ahead of myself. No, we'll get that one separately. What people during the 19th century and the 1800s called they called it the scramble for Africa. Okay. And, Africa was made up of a whole network of African tribes and kingdoms and empires there, but many of them lacked the same access to technology that these European empires did. Some of the Africans did have access to some firearms, some guns, things like that. But the Europeans, by the time you're getting deeper and deeper into the 19th century, yeah, they've got guns, they've got artillery, cannons, they have machine guns eventually. They completely have the African people overwhelmed in terms of military power. And so the Europeans decide that they're going to split Africa up amongst themselves. They get together in 1885 in Berlin in Germany, and they roll out a map of Africa, and it's like, all right, Britain, what are you going to take? France, what do you want? Germany, what are you going to take? And you end up with that map that you see there, and what Africa looks like right on the eve of World War One, 1914. And you end up with only two countries left, which are going to be the countries of Liberia and Ethiopia that are still independent, that are still, African countries run by Africans. The rest of them are taken over by European countries. And again, what they're usually after in these countries are natural resources. Okay. And so whether it's rubber that comes out of, like the Belgian Congo and another of others, timber, from trees that they're chopping down, especially in the interior of Africa. There is some gold to be found in parts of Africa. Eventually down, like in South Africa, they discovered diamonds. There's always something they can find. And these colonies set up, just like we talked about with imperialism, to make money. Okay. And to produce, to find the raw materials that they then take back up to Europe and kind of send into their factories to turn them into manufactured goods. All right, that's that later colonialism, and then you get the flip side of colonialism and imperialism. And by the time you were going in, really as long as people are being colonized, Africa would be a perfect example of it. No one just goes along with this. If you're an African person, live in, a tribal system somewhere in, Libya or Nigeria, and all of a sudden you've got these Europeans marching in, guns all over the place. You try to resist, they kill you. Eventually they break you down and they have you working for them. Okay. You're not going to be happy with that situation, because ultimately you've lost your freedom. And you now answer to these strangers, these people who are not like you, and there's always going to be resistance to that. And so whenever you have these colonies that are set up by basically having to march in and conquer a people, whether it's Native Americans, indigenous people, whether it's the Africans in those various kingdoms and tribal organizations. Yeah, people, it's almost kind of human nature. We want to fight back against that kind of stuff. I want to be free. I want to be, me and my people. Those kind of that idea of nation, is being snuffed out by this, and people want their nations back, and that's where the resistance comes from. Okay. What you end up having, I have a picture of Gandhi over there, who Mahatma Gandhi is an Indian man who will end up leading a massive resistance movement in the country of India. India will end up being a colony of Great Britain as well. Probably in the end, their biggest and most profitable colony. But Gandhi, starting in the early 20th century, starts these movements, these resistance movements. And he's the guy who very famously practices peaceful protest. So resisting the British government and their role in India, but doing it in a way that tries to avoid the use of violence. And as Gandhi says, if we do it, if we just allow ourselves to take the blows that the British are going to rain down on us as they try to get us to do what they want us to do, all it is going to show the world that is the only way the British are able to get anything done here, is through the use of brutal violence. And in the end, it works. Not long after World War II ends in 1945, India wins its independence, and the British pack their bags and go away. You will end up seeing a lot of this in the years after World War II as well. The vast majority of Africa will be what we call decolonized. Okay, Europeans will realize that running the colony is costing them more than the profit they're making from it. And so one by one, the Europeans will, pick it up and they'll leave and they'll grant freedom to the colony that they had controlled for, in many cases, 75, 80, 100 years. Okay, some of the countries like Germany end up losing colonies that they have in Africa after they lose, in World War One. They're stripped of their colonies, and those colonies go to the winners, right, of World War One. But yeah, by the time you get to about the 1970s, most direct control of Africa by Europeans is gone. There's a whole lot of other messes that happen as a result of that, and people being basically, controlled for generations and generations, and suddenly finding themselves free. And that freedom is a great thing, but sometimes there's a downside to it, as you see a lot of conflict and civil wars break out in different parts of Africa in the aftermath of the imperialism era, all those years of imperialism and colonies. And so, it's kind of a good news, bad news kind of a story. And some of the issues, if you pay attention to the news outside of Vancouver and Clark County, you know that there are African countries right now that have all kinds of violence going on. And usually it's civil war. It's African people fighting against each other over the kind of government they want, the way the direction they want their country to go in. And you can draw almost a direct line from that conflict that's going on in 2026 all the way back to that Berlin conference in 1885, when Europeans decide, because we've got bigger armies, we're going to take over Africa and divide it up amongst ourselves. It's like the echoes, the after effects of all that are still felt to this very day. Okay. So you're getting a history lesson here today. It's just history. This is what comes to take the place, especially in Africa, after the era of imperialism comes to an end. And that is what we call neo-colonialism. Okay? I think I may have also seen the term neo-imperialism from time to time as well. And this is where in a lot of those countries, I'll give you an example, a country like Ghana, okay, which had been a British colony. And Ghana was one of the first, early 1950s, one of the first colonies to be given its freedom. The British finally decided, we got too many problems at home. We won World War II, but we have a lot of money, economic problems at home, and we're not making that much money. And so we're going to give Ghana back to the Ghanese people. And they did. The British flag went down, the Ghanese flag goes up. They elect a Ghanese president. He's an African, now ruling over an African country, just kind of the way things had been before the Europeans showed up. But the British didn't totally move out. Okay, yeah, all the government people left, but there were still a lot of British businesses that existed in Ghana, and they were still doing business. And because they employed a lot of the Ghanese people and were part of the local economy there, they're able to kind of have a certain amount of influence over the government. If the government tries to pass some laws to say that, hey, people can't work more than 8 hours a day, the company might say to the government, we actually like the 12-hour day that we've been doing. And if you really get serious about this 8-hour day, you might make us want to pack up and leave and go to another country. And if we do that, a whole lot of your people are suddenly going to be unemployed. And that's going to cause other problems for you. So maybe you need to not so much, go forward with that kind of a rule, that kind of a law. And then the leader of the country is kind of like, I don't want you to leave. I don't want a bunch of my people to be without work, without jobs. So, okay, never mind. No 8-hour day. We'll stick with the 12-hour day. All right. They have that kind of influence, what we call indirect control. It's quiet. It's not really loud. You don't really see it on the surface, but it's usually a little kind of through threats, through a little intimidation, almost kind of like blackmail in a way. It's like, do this thing we want you to do, or we'll leave. And if we leave, it's going to hurt your country. And so the leaders of a lot of these countries, are almost serving these foreign companies more than they're serving their own people. Like it talks about there, sometimes it's going to be that control is going to look very much economic in many cases, and then other times cultural and political. Okay, when you look at Africa in the 21st century, the outside country that has most of this neo-colonialism going on is actually China. China has invested billions and billions of dollars into numerous African countries, building factories and building roads and things like that. Helping to improve and modernize some of these countries. But the flip side of it is those countries, their governments now are kind of beholden to China. It's like China saying, "Hey, we've put all this money in, and what are you going to do for us?" Right? There's kind of that what we call quid pro quo. We did something for you. What are you going to do for us? All right. So that kind of gets into that concept of what neo-colonialism is all about. All right. And then, like I mentioned to you before, some of the after effects of colonialism and imperialism can be really, really ugly. I talked to you about civil wars. Probably one of the most disturbing events to take place after the end of the main era of colonialism and imperialism in Africa happened in the kind of Central African country of Rwanda. Rwanda had been a colony of Belgium back all the way up until the 1960s. And Rwanda made a lot of money, coffee, a little bit of rubber that they were able to produce. They had rubber trees. There were various things that made them very profitable for Belgium. But Belgium, another one of those countries that priorities kind of changed after World War II, and so by the 1960s they granted Rwanda its freedom. Where the Belgians kind of screwed up is the whole time they were running Rwanda, they relied on one ethnic group of the Rwandan population to help them out. They kind of gave them like special privileges, okay? This one kind of cultural group within the overall population. And really, Rwanda back then and still today is kind of divided by these two kind of almost like ethnicities, cultural groups. And the one that got all the privileges while the Belgians were running the colony, well, when they get their freedom, the others who had been given second-class status for all those years wanted revenge. And so in 1994, they started launching attacks against the other cultural group in Rwanda. And it resulted in a genocide incident where more than 1 million people ended up being killed. Okay, and this isn't a war per se. This is people being rounded up and being murdered, not because of anything they did, simply because of who they were. Okay, and that they were not a member of the one ethnic group. They were unfortunately a member of the other group. And that was the group that the Belgians had given all these privileges to during their years of imperialism, of colonialism, right? And it took major involvement from the United Nations, sending in troops in there to get control of the situation. And Rwanda, it's, from 1994 to 2026, it's kind of been an up and down story. They still don't have things completely ironed out and smooth. And, in other parts of Africa, the use of child soldiers and just all kinds of problems that come along when people are controlled by outsiders for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden, the outsiders are gone. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like someone throwing the car keys to a 5-year-old and saying, "Hey, you're on your own. Good luck." And it's like, well, no one taught me how to drive. Well, no one taught the Africans how to run a government, okay? For, like I said, 75, 80, 100 years, they had just been told what to do by the Europeans. And it wasn't like the Europeans said, "Hey, we're going to be leaving, so we need to kind of get you up to date with, hey, here's how you run a country, all right? You do this, you elect, you have elections." No, they just left, all right? And so the fact that Africa has had all of these problems, and a lot of people have very, very negative kind of connotations about Africa even today, and they think it's just something because, well, I guess it's just because of the Africans. It's just how they are, and those are people who they don't know their history. They don't know what Africa has in its past. And the fact that with the exception of those two countries, they were absolutely completely overpowered, controlled, in some cases basically enslaved for years. And then those who treated them that way just basically packed up and left. All right, okay, and then I think this will get us a little bit more into the last topic that we'll cover with this, and this is another one gets pretty much a whole unit in AP World History. One of the last units we cover, and that is the Cold War. And that is a conflict that takes place almost as soon as, I mean, the guns aren't even quite silent at the end of World War II when the Cold War breaks out, and lasts until 1991. Well, we'll get into why it's called a Cold War. It does have nothing to do with snowballs or fighting up in the Arctic regions or that sort of thing. It is a war that is primarily fought between the United States of America and the USSR. Okay, coming out of World War II, we are the two. They came up with a new term to describe us. We were superpowers, right? Before World War II, yeah, you had the old traditional European powers. You had the British and the French, the Germans, But now they have all been either, like in the case of Germany, defeated, or they have been so damaged by World War II that it's going to take them years and years to rebuild. The two countries that stand head and shoulders above the rest is the United States. We, other than attack on our base in Pearl Harbor out in Hawaii, were never attacked directly in our country during World War II. And so we are big, powerful, and untouched at the end of the war. The Soviet Union, they suffered terribly. They had more people die than any other country in World War II. But they created themselves over the course of the war into a massive power. Okay, and a lot of that based on the size of their military. Same with here in the United States. We had an incredible military by the end of World War II. We fought wars on two sides of the world simultaneously against the Germans and against the Japanese, and played, our part, a part in defeating Germany and a huge part in defeating Japan. That war was almost primarily taken on by our forces. So, boom. Okay, and we are two countries that have very, very different ideas about how a country should be run. The Soviet Union, they use communism as their form of government. Here in the United States, democracy, capitalism, right? In the Soviet Union, the government controls their businesses. Over here in America, it's like, no, we don't control the business. If you want to set up a business, go ahead and do it. It's all that kind of a thing. And so, stark differences. In America, we put a lot of value on human rights and rights of the people. Or in the Soviet Union, none of that exists. It's all about the power of the state. And so people have very little rights. Okay, you speak out against your government, you're going to get dragged off to a work camp or something like that, or worse, right? And so this is a war that, even though it will start with just, really at the core of it, the United States and Soviet Union, is actually going to end up involving the major portion of the world. All right, if you can kind of squint and see the picture over there, it shows what they call these Cold War alliances. And so the countries you see in the darker kind of black and gray colors are countries that were either, us, the United States, are direct allies, okay, all of Europe, and then countries that kind of were sort of allies of us, like you see in South America, Australia, and then the red that you see there, the Soviet Union, their allies, and then you see some colors of pink there that are some of the countries that also were semi-allies, okay? And so, yeah, every continent is touched by this Cold War. And, and it pretty much is. It's the United States and Soviet Union turning to these countries and saying, choose your side. Who are you going to back? You're going to back the powers of, the USA and their capitalism, or you're going with the USSR and communism, which is this form of government that always kind of holds out this promise to really poor people that, that they can live a better life. And then in capitalism, we pretty much go with more of a model of, there's always going to be rich, middle, and poor people. And that's just kind of the way the system works. If you are smart and you work your butt off, you could go from being poor to rich, right? And so you got those kind of things, those ideas in conflict as well. But the Cold War is going to spread and be massive this way. Now, why it's called the Cold War is because the two countries that started, the United States and Soviet Union, through the about 40 years of the Cold War, will never fire a direct shot at each other. There will never once in this war be an American soldier taking aim at a Soviet soldier or vice versa. Okay? Instead, the war is going to be fought in a lot of other different ways. Some it's going to be a propaganda war, where you're trying to kind of like, kind of brainwash, your enemy and get them to think that, hey, your government, they're lying to you and, they're keeping things from you and you need to know the truth. There's going to be other ways of fighting this war. They're going to have these immense arms races where they build up all of these nuclear and atomic weapons. But then they don't end up using any of them because everyone knows if they use them, it's going to be the end of mankind. And so you have that kind of thing going back and forth, okay? As close as shooting wars come during the Cold War, it's going to be what we call proxy wars, all right? And proxy wars are shooting wars where the United States might support one country and the Soviet Union might support another country, and then these two countries go to war with each other. Okay, one of the earliest examples of a proxy war is the Korean War that happens from 1950 to 1953. Communist China and the Soviet Union supported North Korea. They wanted all of Korea to be communist. The United States and a number of our allies supported South Korea that wanted a more democratic, a government based more on democracy, and fought a war over who was going to win. And in the end, no one won. And that's, again, we were talking about this the other day, why we end up with a North and South Korea. Okay. And so that is an example of a proxy war. All right. Where you've got this, it's like you're sponsoring these countries and they go to war and you back them and support them. You give them guns, you give them ammunition, you give them the supplies, but you don't actually get directly involved. Okay. Now, in the Korean War, that's a little bit fuzzy because we actually did send some American soldiers over to fight for South Korea. Soviet Union never did. All right. So, yeah, we didn't follow 100% the rules of proxy wars there. Other proxy wars that were fought sometimes in Latin America during the Cold War, in Africa during the Cold War, and then also, if we go back to Asia, the Vietnam War. Okay. Some of you may have, I don't know, seen some movies, or you might even have some, maybe grandpa or some of the older folks in your family. You might have some veterans that have connections back to the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a proxy war as well, all right, and very, very similar to Korea. North Korea was communist, wanted all of Vietnam to be communist. The Soviet Union was one of the communist countries that supported them. And the United States, just like in Korea, we supported South Vietnam, and we actually even sent soldiers, okay, eventually into there. A war that didn't work out too well for us. And when we ended up leaving, the North Vietnamese were able to conquer all of Vietnam. And Vietnam is technically, officially communist to this very day. All right, so that's your proxy wars. Satellite states. These are countries, they're usually are going to be countries that are controlled. And this really is a term that gets attached to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union freed a whole bunch of Eastern European countries at the end of World War II, countries that the Nazis had taken over. And then, as the fighting in World War II was coming towards an end and the Germans were clearly losing, the Soviet Union freed a whole bunch of these Eastern European countries. And then kind of did a little bit of a shocker to us here in the United States and our allies, because they then said, oh, we freed these countries, but actually we're not going to give them their full freedom. We're going to stay here and we're going to use these countries as kind of like a buffer to protect ourselves from potential future attacks by, who knows, maybe the United States. And so what they do in those countries is they do allow them to kind of have a little bit of some control. They have leaders that are people from their own country, but typically they're leaders that are chosen by the Soviet Union. They're the ones that kind of pick who they want to lead. And the Soviet Union kind of plays them almost kind of like, puppets. Matter of fact, some people, you refer to that term, puppet states. I've got satellite states in here for you because it means that these are countries going to be, on the surface look like they have their own country, their own flag, they have a government, but they are highly controlled by the country that has that influence over them. In this case, the Soviet Union. Those countries don't get to decide one day that, we really don't like communism, and, we want to get a little bit closer to kind of like what, Western Europe has, and, get a little bit more democratic. No, the Soviet Union is not going to allow that to happen. If the people try to rise up against the government, the Soviet Union will send in soldiers to put that rebellion, that revolt down. Okay. And again, you could argue that some of the countries the United States supports that during the Cold War are kind of like in a satellite state relationship, but we don't really use that kind of top-down power over other countries. I'm not saying that we're completely innocent of sometimes kind of meddling in the governments of some other countries. We do, and put a lot of pressure and influence on them, but we don't control them as directly as kind of like the Soviet Union was doing in Eastern Europe to countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania, countries like that. Okay, so anyhow, there you go. Proxy war, satellite state. I'm looking at the time. I know we're almost done. All right. And then we have the collapse of communism. The Soviet Union collapses, breaks down. Basically, it's almost kind of as close you get to an empire just going bankrupt. Really, in the end, that is why communism failed. Is the financial problems had grown to be so critical in the Soviet Union that they could not even function as an empire, as a state, as a country anymore. And so all the former parts of the Soviet Union broke away, formed new states. Okay, countries like Chechnya. Countries like Ukraine, that used to be part of the Soviet Union, they established themselves as a separate country. Belarus, that sort of thing, and some of those former parts of the Soviet Union, that transition from being under Soviet control to whatever else they decide to be also ends up leading to some conflict from time to time, and what we see happen in the 1990s. In Yugoslavia would be an example of that. When the Soviets withdraw their power and their support, it leaves a little what we call a power vacuum. It's kind of like, who's in charge? We're not too sure. It's a little bit like what was going on in Africa. And a lot of times it results in violence. You have people within those countries now who are scrabbling for power, and it's where kind of like old prejudices and old scores to be settled, come to the surface. Yugoslavia had, as a population, had a large Christian population and also had a fairly large Muslim population. And you started to have the Christian population starting to sweep up the Muslims, and in some cases, especially men and boys, being killed, being basically executed because of their religious faith. Okay, that is that ethnic cleansing I'm referring to there. They're focusing on the Muslims because of their ethnicity. And a lot of them are people who have more descendancy going back to the Middle East, to the Arab territories in that area, and they're rounded up, because of their faith and because of their heritage, and killed. Another situation that, in the end, the United Nations and NATO had to get involved to bring an end to the violence. All right. And then what? I guess I'll finish up. Oh, I need to update my picture. I can tell this is from this is my 2025 version. I need to flip in the new president in there. Oh well. With the end of the Cold War, we really, I remember when it first ended, a lot of people were like, oh, this is the beginning of a whole new, brand new world. It's going to be a great thing for us, and there'll never be any threats of war anymore. Well, again, if you pay much attention to the news, holy cow, we're in some interesting times right now. But it definitely does create a period of time, and this period of time may be coming to an end in 2026, where we had this really, really tight relationship between the United States and Europe and an organization called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance that we still currently belong to, but is being threatened right now because of some of, just really some of the talk that's going on out there. We're talking about Greenland, and some of this talk about the United States wanting to acquire this semi-autonomous region of Denmark. that has the potential threat of ending our relationship with most of Europe. Some European countries have already said they may be willing to fight alongside Greenlanders if the United States tries to use our military to go in and take over Greenland. And so it's really kind of thrown a new mix into things. Definitely nothing I was talking about 1 year ago when we were covering this. And then we had this war going on between Russia, the main country that comes out of the Soviet Union, Russia, and this war that's been going on between them and Ukraine since 2022. And and again, that's the idea that Vladimir Putin, their leader, wants to, in a way, he's basically said that he's not talking about using communism, but he kind of wants to rebuild that old empire. And part of that means that some of these countries that gained their independence when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, we would like to get them back, or parts of them back. And that's really where that whole conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine really comes down to. Ukraine is very valuable in terms of agriculture and industry, and Russia misses them and wants them back in there, whether they want to or not. And that's why the fighting continues there. All right. These are probably the longest video notes that we are going to be taking, hopefully all year long. But we made some good progress. Okay, I'm going to end it. You can write down Roman numeral 3, but that I'm 40 minutes in, and we're going to hit the brakes here. Okay, that's the end of your history lesson. All right, and I'll see you back in the classroom. Bye.